Hello, everybody. This is Kenneth with the Advancing Equity Coalition. Not here with Heather today, but still we have the amazing Jillian Stockmo-Chapman here to talk about ESSER 3. How are you doing today, Jillian?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So excited to have you. Jillian's official title is the Education Project Specialist at the Graves Foundation, but what I like to call her is the ESSER expert because she's just taught me so much about ESSER. Anytime I have a question, I'm texting her. And so I'm just so happy to have you here to share your knowledge and share your expertise with everyone who's listening. So thanks for doing this.
Yeah, I'm excited. You're being really generous with the expert nod there, but I do what I can, and I read a lot, and I've been really interested in ESSER and to see how it's going to kind of play out in Minneapolis and Minnesota. And so I've got a little bit of knowledge to share with folks. So yeah, I'm excited for today. Excited for what we're going to talk about.
So yeah, let's get into it. So the basics. What is ESSER? What does that even stand for? And why is it so important? Why is it a topic that we need to be paying attention to?
Yeah, so ESSER is an acronym, and it stands for Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief. It is a part of the American Rescue Plan. And so when you kind of hear folks talking about these two things, you'll hear those two acronyms, ARP and ESSER. What's really important is that ARP, so the American Rescue Plan, is a massive federal stimulus package. And so again, this is money that's coming from President Biden. It's coming from the Fed. It is not coming from the state legislature, and it's not replacing funding that's going to be coming from the state legislature. So overall, you can see on the screen, it's 1.9 trillion, kind of with what we got to Minnesota. That was kind of split off to public transit, state and local government, childcare, colleges and universities, and then a huge chunk goes to K-12 and goes to K-12 institutions. And so that is the ESSER 3 funding that we're going to be talking about today.
So just to be clear, Minnesota got $1.9 trillion of this America Rescue Plan, or is that what went to the entire country?
That's the entire country.
I just wanted to be sure. I was like, wait, what? See, this is all so confusing. Okay.
We would be having really different budget conversations if we had $1.9 trillion.
My goodness. Okay. So 170 billion is going to education generally. How much is Minneapolis Public Schools getting?
Yeah, for ESSER 3, Minneapolis Public Schools is slated to get around, I like to say 150 plus million. And the way that's kind of calculated is through Title I. And so the Title I formula is how we're going to be figuring out district allocations. And so that number's fluctuated a little bit, but the most recent one that I've heard is around 150 plus million.
So
to Minneapolis.
That's a lot of money, like a lot of money, right? Like this isn't just like, I think at times, and especially over some of the different COVID relief disbursements that have happened over the last year, people have been like, yeah, that's money, but it's not, it's to help make us whole. But $159 million is like a lot of money, right?
Yeah, and I think what's really important too is that ESSER 3 comes on top of ESSER 1 and 2. And so those were two additional buckets of funding that districts had access to. And Minneapolis, over those two disbursements, I want to say had roughly 88 million, something like that, over those two disbursements. The way I kind of like to think about the funding is that ESSER 1, ESSER 2 are really the buckets that we used for sanitizing the buildings, getting PPE, cleaning and facilities. Those were our relief and recovery dollars throughout the pandemic. Now, this big investment from the Fed is saying, hopefully you've had some relief, some recovery from COVID. this is your transformative bucket. Like, this is the bucket to say, we know that kids need more than what they've been given over the year. This is a huge surplus of funding to help you do something different, to educate the whole child, to build back better. Like, a lot of those things that we've been hearing around what schools, schools did everything during the pandemic. So, like, let's figure out how we come out of this with stronger schools, stronger systems, and really, like, stronger kids. So that's kind of like how we think about the third bucket, or I think about the third bucket.
Yeah. So, okay. So that's a lot of money, and that's exciting, right? Like, this is money and a moment to reimagine, what we can do with resources in a school district, right? And hopefully, right, like, this could be an opportunity to demonstrate also to state legislators, to our federal government, our Congress people, our senators, like, what a substantial investment in education could look like if you all stay committed to this longer. But we know this money is time limited, and so how quickly does this money need to be spent, and how, what do we need to be worried about in terms of timelines?
Yeah, the spending deadline for ESSER 3 is September 2024. And I think the really big thing that folks should be thinking about and considering is, like, this is one-time federal funding. We're not going to see numbers like 1.9 trillion or in Minneapolis's case, 150 plus million. That's not going to come up again. And so what's really important is that this money be used to not do unsustainable things, because I would guess that our state legislature does not have the capacity to come in and fund at this level going forward. And so it is an opportunity, but it also can be kind of problematic for the future, depending on how districts want to spend it. And so that would be the big thing I would be thinking about is, it's a lot over a short timeline, and it's not guaranteed to extend past that timeline. So how are districts using it strategically, so that they're not creating fiscal cliffs or giant budget holes or things like that in the future?
Yeah. So, I think what's also important to remember about this money, and also thinking about it in terms of ESSER 1 and ESSER 2, if you've been paying attention to our most recent board recaps with me and Heather, at the last board meeting, there was the first reading of the budget, right? And the first reading of the budget had a balanced budget for Minneapolis with no gaps or anything like that, because the district balanced the budget with remaining ESSER 2 dollars. And so I say that because, one, of the sustainability, right? Like, we still have budget concerns and fiscal concerns in Minneapolis. It was just that the federal government was able to, bail us out a little bit with the timing of everything that happened and the money that the district received. And I also say that because of this, again, $160 million that Minneapolis Public Schools could receive from ESSER 3, not a single cent has been spent yet, right? And so they have 3 years to figure out how they're going to spend $160 million. So I shouldn't say that. They're going to have 3 years to spend $160 million. They need to figure out how they're going to spend that money in a little bit less time. And so, like Jillian is saying, like, this is our moment, right? Like, we've balanced this budget now. Like, now what do we need to do to, make sure that Minneapolis Public Schools at the end of 2024 is on better footing when it comes to our finances and is more sustainable? But also, that, I think that theory of change has to be not how do we have more money long term, but how do we serve students better so that more families want to select Minneapolis Public Schools and we can serve them properly. And so I think that's the question, is like, what is the thing that we invest in order to do that?
Yeah. And I do not have the answer to that question. Like, I am not the I'm not the MPS district expert that can tell you that idea. But I do think when we think about funding like this, it doesn't solve the problems that plague our systems. So for MPS in particular, a huge influx of funding like this is not going to solve enrollment decline. It's not going to solve some of the other challenges that have been facing the district. And so some of this could be used creatively to kind of fix the problems, but I think you have to identify what are those that you want to solve, and then what are the like unique opportunities that you can get folks excited about, and that will change, that will really change things for students within the district. And so the thing I like to say is that this is unprecedented. Like it's you hear that word all the time, like this funding is unprecedented, but one of the biggest things we should be looking for going forward is just hearing what the plan is, having the district be really transparent, using this as an opportunity to get community excited and involved and engaged. I would love this to be a moment where we over communicate like ridiculously around what we're doing with this. Because I think it could really make an impact in having folks build trust within a system and build trust within the district.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that my concern when looking at, what's been happening so far is like, we aren't going down that path of over communicating. I get the sense that we're going down the path of like, business as usual, or like maybe under communicating because of capacity reasons, because of, so many things are going on. And also because, maybe one of the things that MPS needs to look at investing is like, how do we communicate, right? Like that is a thing that we could talk about. And so, I pulled this slide up and share this slide because these are the things that have been shared with a stakeholder committee that I sit on around how MPS actually wants to, is thinking about where this money should be used. And so some of this is around safely reopening schools, which also, ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 were supposed to be investing in. And so the question is like, whether was that not enough money to safely reopen schools, or how is that money used differently? And so I think that's a question that we just need better information about and more transparency around, because, again, there's been so many things to follow last year that's definitely fallen through the cracks. The other two bullet points here: deliver on our promise to provide a well-rounded, culturally relevant academic experience across Minneapolis public schools. Like basically what they're saying is like, we need to put money towards our mission and vision of it as a district. And so that can go towards anything. Like that's the exciting thing, right? Like that is very, very broad and very, very open. And so what are the ways though that we aren't just using the money in ways that we've always used the money? To, Jillian's point here, like this is our opportunity to be innovative and imaginative, but also critical, and like to be thinking about, we need to make sure that the ways that we're using this money are that we invest this money are effective, right? And like, how are we evaluating that? Or are we just going to expand programs that haven't worked? And I think that's been a concern of our coalition members, certainly. And then finally is to sustain schools and staffing through some anticipated changes. And so, like you were saying earlier, Jillian, and I'll stop sharing my screen and sharing this slide, is like, we need to figure out like how we're not going to be on this precipice of a fiscal cliff, right? Like how we're not on the edge here. And, my hope is that we spend a lot of money in that second bullet point, right? Around like the full mission and vision of the district, and helping the district actually achieve and move closer and towards their vision as a district. But I have a concern that logistically they're going to want to default into that first and third bullet point, which is, we don't want to be in debt. We want to safely reopen our buildings, which is fair. Like that has to happen. But where have other investments gone then has to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, I think you bring up such a good point there. This is going to be a dance of balancing the practical and the imaginative, and balancing the, having a healthy fund balance, having like a healthy balanced budget is critical for districts. Maintaining your staffing levels, like some of those things are so critical. While also, how do you hold that in balance with this is what we could do differently to serve the students who haven't been served in our buildings and haven't been served in our system. And so one of the things I would say is those two, if you were prioritizing one over the other, could lead disaster with this funding either way. And funding is great, but it's also not everything. And so I also like to say that too is this is a lot, but it's going to be up to, how the leaders use it, how how it gets to where it needs to go, how our system supports it. And it's not the end all be all, but it is a historic investment in ways that we haven't seen before.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say too is the third bullet kind of talked to that is there's also going to be state funding that's coming in. And so we could do a whole nother conversation on where state funding is right now, kind of in the Senate and the legislature, but that's also going to be coming to the district. And I think it's going to be a moment of a lot of resource and how do we do what's best for kids and best for families with a lot of resource. So that's what I'd add in there.
Yeah. I would, just like a quick aside on the base budget for MPS. Again, the budget that was shared at the board meeting last week, I believe senior officer GOP's mode of operating is because of the way that our timelines and the timelines of the district and the timelines of the state are all messed up. I believe it's always
so messed up.
Yeah. I believe that senior officer GOP's mode of operation is they are predicting no increase in the budget for this year. They're predicting no increase. And so in terms of the allocation of going to school. So they're presuming that they're not going to get any additional dollars that they haven't already gotten from the state, which generally is never true. There's usually at least a 1% increase. I think the district and lots of people are hoping that there'll be more than a 1%, maybe a 2% increase.
I do.
But there is also a world where actually MPS gets more money than they're budgeting right now, which is exciting. And on top of that, we'll get $160 million, right? And so there's just a lot of things to be looking at. But I know we've been talking for a little bit. I do want to hit a few more points and then I'll let you go.
Okay.
First, community engagement. So again, this money is unprecedented. It's a space for our district to do things differently. But if we have the same leaders making the same decisions, we're not going to be doing things differently. We might expand programs that have been under-resourced or, they've been wanting to grow but haven't had a chance to. But what is the federal kind of guidance around, again, how this money should be spent, but then also on top of that, what is the federal guidance around how they're engaging community with this?
Yeah, I'll start with the federal kind of community engagement piece, because this is new for ESSER 3. I didn't see this in ESSER 1 or 2. And so there was this addition to ESSER 3 about meaningful consultation. Now, it's buried in a whole lot of federal language, but essentially what they're saying is that districts have to engage stakeholder groups and engage the public with an opportunity to give input on the development of their plan to spend this funding. The way that they're supposed to do that is utilize the systems that they have already. There's no framework to say, build out a new community engagement system or anything like that. But there is a distinct call out in ESSER 3 that says you must engage with folks across all different groups. They call out students, they call out families, they call out administrators, they call out school leaders, school staff. They call out, folks who serve English language learners, students experiencing homelessness. There is a very specific call in meaningful consultation at the federal level to work with those who have been most affected by the pandemic, and to expand who actually gets input on how these dollars are spent.
Yeah. I mean, I just think it's challenging because I think um, I don't know if MPS has really ever defined like community engagement for them and then like the structure. So then I think we have a lot of different ideas on what community engagement should look like versus what MPS views as community engagement. And so it's tricky because right now, from what I understand about MPS's community engagement structure, is they're going to some of their parent advisory councils. They've also set up this stakeholder committee that I mentioned that I'm a part of as well as a few other coalition members and folks like that. And that's what I think they've been using predominantly to get feedback on their COVID reopening plan. Like as they've started to, from the beginning of the school year, as they were moving through their phases, and we were kind of all remember the dial and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Like that was the structure that they were using. And so I think they're replicating that for the ESSER 3. But also, Heather and I have talked about this a lot, is, the standard shouldn't be that. Like the standard should be they got 90% of their students to select whether or not they wanted to be in school or they wanted to continue distance learning. Like they got 90% response rate, like, which is amazing. So why isn't that the standard for, like, we should be reaching at least 90% of our families to weigh in on like how this money should be spent. And then you can also go back to like the CDD, and obviously that was a world before the pandemic, but they're doing information sessions, school sessions. I know that they're still even talking to site councils individually about this. And so I just think like, they obviously use community engagement and view community engagement differently throughout. But their structure is always different. And so it's like, so I think some people expect the road show, right? People want to see the road show. Some people expect, the survey, are they sending out surveys or are they soliciting feedback? And so I think that's difficult and a challenge.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah. And I think you're hitting on something really important there too, is that this is one of those areas that districts kind of just have to figure out on their own. Like besides what I just told you about meaningful consultation, there's no real roadmap on like, here's how to do that. And at the same time, the state isn't MDE, and the state, they aren't coming in to say like, here's how to do this best, or here's best practices for this, or here's our expectation of how many families or what community groups you're going to engage with. It's kind of just like, you should do this, check. And I think you're calling on something so important, is that it's really up to the discretion of districts on how they do it and if they do it well. One thing I would say is that, some of this funding could be used to build in stronger engagement opportunities for folks who haven't been engaged with districts. It could help to build in and work through some of those tensions that you just highlighted. And so that's not completely out of bounds either.
Yeah. So quickly, just want to hear, I know there's like limited restrictions, but there are some restrictions on how this money should be spent. Can you walk us through what that looks like?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones that I'd call out that I think is exciting, right? So you saw that the state funding for this, the money that the Department of Education is getting, is much more restricted, in my opinion, than what districts are getting. But one of the restrictions that districts have is that at least 20%, so for MPS, 20% of that 150 plus million has to be used to address learning loss for students who were disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And the federal language calls out everything from whether it's racial and ethnic group based, low income based, whether it's language learners, gender, disabilities, housing status. Like, it is so explicit in saying 20% of this has to be used to the kids who had it the hardest and really struggled during this pandemic. This is funding for them to accelerate their learning, to give them support as a whole child. And I think that's really exciting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really exciting. And also, again, like with the flexibility, sometimes, and I'll be honest, right? Like sometimes for me, like when there isn't a lot of structure, there isn't a lot of guidance, there isn't a lot of parameters, like it's overwhelming, right? And so
Very true.
I'm like, oh my gosh, like you mean I can do anything? I can start anything. And so I think that is definitely a place where I could imagine, if I were a superintendent or, a cabinet member of a district, I would be really overwhelmed with like, if I could spend this money on almost anything, what would I spend it on? Um, so I think that's
And
notable.
it's not almost anything. But I would just say that there's more discretion, I think, with some of this than there has been in the past. But with things like meaningful consultation, hopefully is oversight. Like that's kind of what they built in with ESSER 3 was
Sure.
that there's still a bucket of what you can spend it on, but it's a little bit bigger because there are other things that are going to be watching as you spend this down.
Gotcha. All right.
Yeah.
So last thought is, okay, so we know MPS, 160 million federal dollars need to use in 3 years, right? There are some limits on what they have to spend it on. And that money is not going to come back again in 3 years, right? And so this is kind of one-time money. So that's like the high-level overview.
Yeah.
They should be using it innovatively, right? That's the other part. What is the last thing that you think people absolutely need to know about before, they start reaching out to their school board members or the superintendent around how they think this money should be spent, or what is just something that you'd like to leave people with to be thinking about?
Yeah. What I would say is that if I could wave my magic wand and call into truth everything that's going to come out of my mouth, is that every single dollar that comes through ESSER 3 is spent breaking down structural barriers and racial barriers within our system. Like I cannot imagine a better moment to do that and to do it differently. And so what I would tell folks and what I would think about is, if we can't trace every single penny of this 150 million and how it's going to affect and break down the barriers that we see within MPS, then it's not doing its job, because that is the opportunity. And that is the opportunity of now that may not come again in 3 years when this goes away. I really do think that this is the way to break down some of the structural barriers and the inequities that we see, and hope that districts, take that on full on and like scream that in how they spend this funding.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I'll say too is hold this funding in balance with state funding, because we know state funding is going to come, and if we can use the federal funding to do what I just said and use the state funding to do all of what we need to continue to do on a regular basis, I think we can be in good shape.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. So my last thought I want to share with people is, first, I just want them to look at this slide. This is a little bit of an outline around what MPS has shared again with the Stakeholder Committee around how they feel like this money will be spent or could be spent, like the goals of the money, essentially, right? And so what I'll point out is, in the previous slide that I shared, where it outlined like the districts or the board's values and what they want to spend the money on, and then in this one, we don't see anything necessarily that is in alignment with what Jillian shared earlier about this needs to go to very specific targeted groups, right? And so we don't see that called out here. We kind of see just a general, like a general allotment of and allocation of dollars. And this points me back to the conversation that And that my do better moment actually from our last school board recap, which was our district essentially said, our superintendent essentially said, we can't afford equity. And at the end of the day, like, one, now we have $160 million to hopefully afford equity. But equity is not
all at equity.
right. But at the end of the day, like, equity is not a thing that we can purchase. Equity is a mindset. Equity is a process. Equity is a framework. And so when we see presentations like this that don't take into consideration how we're going to spend this money equitably, and also to think about the resources that we have in our hands in this current moment, whether or not, ESSER 3 comes, or if there's an ESSER 4, whatever, like, what is the money that is the resources that are in our hands that we can equitably utilize to make sure that we meet the needs of folks who have been disproportionately impacted. We'll hear school board members, we'll hear all these people say, like, oh, we know that this pandemic has disproportionately impacted people. Yes, and also the system has negatively disproportionately impacted lots of people, lots of students, lots of families, lots of communities. And so, like, we need to be thinking about how do we actually infuse equity in everything that we do, and not just as like a talking point or a stump speech, because it's not a moment around whether or not we can afford equity. It's a mindset that we need to be, like, dogged about continuing to apply. And so that's my thought. And so as you're going out and talking about this money with people, be demanding that there's a plan for an equitable use of this money, and not just like throwing this at the system as a blanket.
That is so spot on. And thank you for sharing that. That's really spot on.
So this was a lot of fun. I know it was a little longer than I told you it would be, but I appreciate the time. Thank you so much. And I hope everyone enjoyed and listened. And so we will include our link again to our ESSER survey so that I can share that, our coalition can share that with district leadership during our stakeholder meeting this Thursday. So please fill out our survey. Let us know what you think this money should be spent on, what issues you think this money should be solving, and we will share that with leadership. Thank you so much, Jillian. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Kenneth.
Bye.
Bye.